My husband Leonard died on a Sunday morning in September, 3 weeks before our 41st wedding anniversary. He died the way he had lived, quietly, without fuss, without asking anyone to rearrange their plans on his behalf. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March. He had told me in April, after he had spent 3 weeks, characteristically, reading everything there was to read about the disease and its trajectory, so that when he told me, he could also tell me what to expect and roughly when and what we should do with the time we had. We did a great deal with the time we had. We went to Italy, which we had talked about for 20 years and had always managed to defer for reasons that seemed important at the time and seem very small now. We had long, honest conversations about things we had somehow never gotten around to saying in 41 years of ordinary daily life. We held hands more than we had since the early years. I read to him, in the evenings, from the novels he had always meant to read and never had. He died on a Sunday morning in September, in our bedroom, with me beside him, in the specific way the hospice nurses had prepared me for, and which was, in the end, as peaceful as anything terrible can be. 3 days after the funeral, going through the drawer of his bedside table, I found an envelope. My name was on the front in Leonard's handwriting. Below it, in smaller writing, were 3 words, "When you're ready." Inside the envelope was a single folded sheet of paper. On it were 14 names. Beneath each name was an address. Beneath the addresses was one sentence, written in the specific careful handwriting Leonard used for things he considered important. The sentence said, "These people know what I wanted them to know. I hope, when you are ready, you will want to know it too. My name is Dorothy Ellsworth. I was married to Leonard for 41 years. I believed, completely and without reservation, that I knew him. It took me 6 months before I was ready to open that envelope properly. And then it took me another year to follow every name on the list. What I found, at the end of that year, was not what I expected. It was better than what I expected. And harder. And more beautiful. And more complicated. And more completely Leonard than anything I had encountered in 41 years of knowing him. This is the story of what those 14 names led me to. Before I follow the names, I need to tell you about Leonard, because the names will not make sense without him, and the names are the entire story. Leonard James Ellsworth was, when I met him in 1978, a secondary school mathematics teacher at a comprehensive school in the north of England. He was 28. He had been teaching for 4 years. He had, already, the quality that I would come to recognize as his defining characteristic, a quality I have never found exactly the right word for, though I have tried many times over 41 years. The closest I have come is this: Leonard paid attention to people in a way that made them feel, while he was paying attention to them, as though they were the most specific and irreplaceable version of themselves that existed. Not the most important person in the room. Not the most impressive. The most themselves. The most precisely, individually who they were. He noticed things about people that other people did not notice, and he remembered them, and he referenced them in ways that told people their particular details had been held and treasured. I fell in love with this quality long before I fell in love with Leonard specifically. I fell in love with watching him do it to other people, to his students, to the dinner guests who came to our early married home, to the elderly neighbor whose specific type of biscuit he remembered across a gap of 3 years between visits. And then I fell in love with him doing it to me, which is a different and more permanent experience. We married in 1979. We had 2 children, our son Philip, born in 1981, and our daughter Sarah, born in 1984. We lived in 3 different houses across 41 years, each one slightly larger than the last, in the same general area of the city, because Leonard had strong opinions about the value of continuity of community and I had come to agree with him. Leonard taught mathematics for his entire working life. He was not a man who climbed. He was offered department head twice and declined both times, because department head meant less time with students and more time with administration, and Leonard's view of administration was that it was the thing that happened when you spent too much time away from the thing that actually mattered. What actually mattered, to Leonard, was the students. He taught at 3 different schools across his career, 2 moves necessitated by school closures rather than any ambition of his own, and at each school he was the teacher whose name former students remembered 20 years later. The teacher who had believed in them specifically, individually, in the way that leaves a mark. He retired at 63, 9 years before the diagnosis. In retirement he read voraciously, grew vegetables with an engineer's precision, attended a philosophy discussion group on Thursday evenings, and volunteered 2 mornings a week at a local charity that supported young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into further education. The charity was called the Gateway Project. I knew he volunteered there. I knew he found the work meaningful. I had been to one of their annual fundraising events with him, perhaps 5 years before the diagnosis, and had shaken hands with the director and admired the photographs on the walls of young people receiving their qualification certificates. I had not known, in any specific detail, what Leonard actually did there. The list of names was about to tell me. But first I need to tell you about the 6 months I spent not being ready to open the envelope. I have been asked many times, in the year since I followed the names, why I waited 6 months before I opened the envelope properly. People seem to find the waiting puzzling, as though the natural response to a mystery left by a beloved husband would be immediate investigation. I want to explain the waiting, because I think it is the most honest part of the whole story. The first reason is simple: grief. In the months following Leonard's death, I was not capable of receiving any new information about him. I was entirely occupied with the process of losing him, the daily, grinding, unexpectedly physical experience of adjusting to the absence of someone whose presence had structured your life for 4 decades. The way the mornings felt wrong without his specific sounds in the kitchen. The way I kept turning to say things to him and finding the space where he had been. The way his absence had a specific texture and weight that was present all the time, even when I was not consciously thinking about him. I was not in a state to absorb anything new about Leonard. I was still in the process of absorbing the most fundamental new fact about him, which was that he was gone. The second reason is more specific to Leonard and to me. The envelope said, "When you're ready." Leonard had written those words deliberately. He had spent 3 weeks reading about pancreatic cancer before he told me about his diagnosis. He was a man who prepared carefully and communicated precisely. When you're ready meant something specific. It meant, not now. It meant, this will keep. It meant, take the time you need before you try to take this in. I trusted that instruction the way I had trusted most of Leonard's instructions over 41 years, which is to say, completely, and with the knowledge that he had thought about it more carefully than I might have done myself. The third reason I tell people less often, because it requires a more honest account of my state of mind in those months than I am always comfortable sharing. I was afraid of what was in the envelope. Not afraid in a dramatic sense. Not afraid that Leonard had done something terrible. He was not, fundamentally, capable of terrible. But the envelope and the names were a reminder that there were things about my husband that I did not know. That a man I had been married to for 41 years had felt, for whatever reason, that certain things needed to be communicated through a list of names rather than directly to me while he was alive. And I was not, in those first 6 months, ready to confront the implications of that. I kept the envelope in the bedside drawer where I had found it. I opened it occasionally and looked at the folded sheet without unfolding it. I ran my thumb over Leonard's handwriting on the front. I put it back. In January, 6 months after the funeral, I had a conversation with my daughter Sarah that changed things. Sarah was visiting for a weekend. On the Sunday morning we were sitting in the kitchen with coffee and she said, very gently, "Mum, Dad left you an envelope. Are you going to open it?" I said, "I have opened it. There's a list of names." She said, "Do you know whose names?" I said, "No." I haven't looked them up. She said, would you like to? I sat with that question for a long moment. I said, I think I would. I think I'm almost ready. She said, I'll stay another day if you want company for the first one. I said, I think this is something I need to do on my own. But thank you. Sarah left on Sunday afternoon. On Monday morning I made a pot of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and unfolded the sheet of paper for the first time. 14 names. 14 addresses. 1 sentence. I looked at the first name on the list. It was a name I did not recognize. I typed it into the search engine on my laptop. And something entirely unexpected appeared on my screen. The first name on Leonard's list was Marcus Webb. When I typed Marcus Webb into the search engine, the first result that appeared was a profile on a professional networking site. The profile photograph showed a young black man, mid-30s, in professional clothing, with the specific expression of a profile photograph, slightly formal, slightly self-conscious, professional. His current position was listed as senior civil engineer at a large infrastructure firm. Beneath the current position were his qualifications: a first-class degree in civil engineering from a university in the north of England, followed by a master's degree, followed by a series of professional certifications. I looked at the university. It was the same university in the same city where Leonard had volunteered at the Gateway Project. I looked at the dates. Marcus Webb had begun his undergraduate degree approximately 3 years after Leonard had started volunteering at Gateway. I sat with that for a moment. Then I did something I had not anticipated doing. I found a contact email address on Marcus Webb's professional profile. I wrote him an email. The email took me an hour to write, because there is no entirely natural way to explain to a stranger that your late husband left their name on a list and you are trying to understand why. I settled, eventually, on the simplest possible version, that my husband Leonard Ellsworth had passed away and had left me a list of names, and that Marcus Webb's name was on it, and that I was hoping he might be willing to speak with me. I sent the email. Marcus Webb replied within 4 hours. His reply was 3 sentences long. It said, Mrs. Ellsworth. I was so very sorry to hear about Leonard. He was one of the most important people in my life, and I would be honored to speak with you whenever you are ready. One of the most important people in my life. I read that sentence perhaps 10 times. We arranged a video call for the following Saturday morning. I want to tell you about that call in some detail, because it was the call that gave me the framework for understanding everything that came after. Marcus Webb appeared on my screen at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, from what appeared to be a home office, bookshelves visible behind him, a desk lamp, a mug of coffee. He was 34 years old. He had the careful, warm, slightly formal manner of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was not entirely sure how it would go. He said, "Thank you for reaching out, Mrs. Ellsworth. I've wanted to contact you since I heard about Leonard, but I didn't want to intrude during your grief, and I wasn't sure what you knew." I said, "What I know is a list of names. Yours is the first. I am hoping you can help me understand." He said, "How much do you know about the Gateway Project?" I said, "Leonard volunteered there 2 mornings a week." I knew it was important to him. I didn't know the specifics. He said, "Leonard was my mentor at Gateway. I came to the program when I was 16. My parents had separated the previous year and my mom was struggling, single parent, 3 kids, working 2 jobs. My school was fine, but there wasn't much in the way of individual attention for students thinking about university. I had decent grades in maths and science but no idea how to navigate the application process, no family history of higher education, and nobody to tell me what engineering actually was as a career beyond what I'd seen on television." He paused. He said, "Leonard came into my life at a Gateway meeting when I was 16 and a half. He sat across from me at a table in the community center where the meetings were held and he asked me what I was interested in. Not what I was good at, what I was interested in. I said bridges. I said I'd been obsessed with bridges since I was a kid, the mechanics of them, how they worked. And he said, this is the exact thing he said, I have never forgotten it, he said, that is called civil engineering, and the world has not yet had the specific engineer that you are going to be. Marcus stopped. He looked at his mug for a moment. He said, no one had ever said anything like that to me before. Not that specifically, not about me. My teachers were good teachers, but I was one of 30. Leonard was, he was the first person who ever talked to me about my specific future as though it was real and achievable and worth planning for. I sat at my kitchen table, 700 miles from Marcus Webb's home office, and I felt something settle in my chest that I recognized, after a moment, as the particular feeling of understanding someone you loved more completely than you had the moment before. I said, how long did Leonard work with you? Marcus said, from when I was 16 until I graduated. 6 years of regular meetings, help with applications, someone to call when the first year of university was harder than I expected and I nearly quit. He drove to the campus once, 4 hours each way, because I called him on a Tuesday evening and told him I was going to withdraw. He sat with me for 3 hours and then drove back. He never mentioned the driving. Not once. I said, I didn't know about the drive. Marcus said, I think he didn't tell you because he didn't want it to seem like a sacrifice. He used to say, when I thanked him, which I did often, he used to say that he was just filling in the parts of the picture that were missing, and the picture itself was already there. He meant the picture of who I was. He meant he could see it and was just helping me see it too. I said, that is very Leonard. Marcus said, I know. I know that now, having heard him say it many times. At 16 it felt like the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever said to me. It still does, actually, when I think about it. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of the call I knew 3 things I had not known at the beginning. I knew that Leonard had, for the last 9 years of his working life and through his entire retirement, been a mentor to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who were trying to navigate the path to further education and professional life. I knew that he had done this with the same specific, attentive, individualized quality that I had spent 41 years watching him apply to everyone he encountered. And I knew that Marcus Webb was a senior civil engineer who built bridges, and that a significant part of the reason he was building bridges was because Leonard had sat across from him at a table in a community center when he was 16 and a half and said the specific true thing. I also knew that there were 13 more names on the list. I started the next one the following Monday. I want to tell you about the next 5 names, because each one added something to the picture of Leonard that the previous one had begun, and because by the 6th name I understood something about what he had been doing and why the list existed that changed how I read everything that followed. The second name was Priya Sharma. Priya was 31. She was a GP in a practice in the Midlands. She had grown up in our city in a family of 5 children, her parents both working in textile manufacturing, her father having arrived from India in his 20s with qualifications that were not recognized in the UK and had spent 30 years doing work that required a fraction of his actual training. Priya had wanted to be a doctor since she was 7 years old. She had come to the Gateway Project at 15, referred by her secondary school Senko, who had identified her as a student with exceptional ability and very limited guidance on how to translate that ability into the specific, competitive path to medical school. Leonard had worked with her for 5 years. He had helped her understand the medical school application process. He had connected her with a doctor who agreed to do work experience supervision. He had reviewed her personal statement, 6 full drafts, Priya told me, each one returned with precise, respectful, line-by-line notes. She had been accepted to her first-choice medical school. She was now a GP. She had a particular interest in patients from communities like her own, communities where the navigation of healthcare systems was complicated by language, cultural unfamiliarity, and the residue of experiences in which professionals had not always treated them with the specificity and respect they deserved. She said, Leonard used to say that every patient is the only patient. The only person with exactly their particular set of circumstances and fears and history. I think about that every single clinic day. I think about him saying it. The third name was James Okonkwo. James was 29. He was a secondary school mathematics teacher. He had grown up in care, moved between foster placements 8 times between the ages of 7 and 16, and had come to the Gateway Project through a leaving care charity that had identified him as a young man with academic potential and no one in his life to help him realize it. James taught mathematics at the same school, as it happened, where Leonard had started his own career. When I mentioned this to James on our video call, he was quiet for a moment. He said, I know. Leonard told me. He suggested it. He said the school had a history of good mathematics teaching and I should consider it. I think he wanted something to come full circle. That was very like him. I said, Are you happy there? He said, I am. I have a form group I've been with for 2 years. There's a boy in the group who reminds me of myself at that age, bright, difficult home situation, doesn't quite believe the future is real. I work with him the way Leonard worked with me. The fourth name was Sion Williams. Sion was 33. She was a solicitor. She had grown up in a former mining community where the grammar school had closed before she was born and the secondary modern that replaced it had not yet adjusted to the idea that its students might aspire to professional careers. Her parents had supported her completely and without any framework for how to help her do what she wanted to do, which was law, which might as well have been the moon for all the practical guidance available to her in her community. Leonard had worked with Sion for 4 years. He had, characteristically, said very little about law itself, he knew nothing about law, and a great deal about how to find the people who did know, how to ask the right questions, how to build the specific network of knowledge and connection that the children of lawyers received automatically and the children of miners had to construct deliberately. She said, he used to say that the information people need is always available. The only unequal thing is whether you happen to know who has it. His job, he said, was to help close that gap. The fifth name was Amir Hassan. Amir was 36. He ran his own architecture practice, small but growing, specializing in sustainable housing projects for social landlords. He had arrived in England with his family as a refugee from Syria when he was 12. His English had been minimal. His mathematical and spatial reasoning, as identified by a patient secondary school teacher, had been exceptional. Leonard had worked with Amir for 8 years, the longest working relationship on the list. 8 years, from the age of 15 through his degree and his early career, navigating a system that was complicated for anyone and considerably more complicated for a young man without British citizenship for most of that period. Amir said, Leonard never treated my situation as a complication. He treated it as one of the specific things about me that made me who I was. He said that my specific path, the displacement, the language, the starting again, was giving me something that no straightforward path could give. He said, you understand what it is to lose home and make a new one. That is the most important thing an architect of homes can understand. I sat with that sentence for a very long time after the call ended. The sixth name was Emma Clark. Emma was 26. She was the youngest person on the list. She was a primary school teacher. Emma had come to the Gateway Project when she was 18, after leaving school with good grades but no university offer and a deeply uncertain sense of what she was capable of and what she deserved. She had grown up with a mother who struggled with alcohol dependency, and the domestic instability of her childhood had left her with what she described, with extraordinary candor, as a fundamental uncertainty about whether her own needs and ambitions were real things worth pursuing or selfish impositions on a world that had more important things to manage. She said, Leonard was the first person who told me that wanting things for myself was not selfish. He said it in a very matter-of-fact way, like it was obvious, like everyone knew this, and he was just reminding me. He said, Emma, your ambitions are real. They are as real as anyone else's. The fact that you have had to spend energy managing circumstances that other people did not have to manage does not mean you are entitled to less. It means you have already demonstrated a capacity for difficulty that many of your peers have not had the opportunity to develop. I'd argue that makes you more qualified, not less. She stopped. She said, I have that written down. He said it to me when I was 19 and I wrote it down immediately afterward and I have kept it. I said, he was like that. He thought carefully before he said things and then he said them exactly. She said, I know. I think about how much, I think about the fact that he didn't have to do any of this. He was retired. He could have been doing anything with his Tuesdays and Thursdays. And he chose to sit in a community center with people like me and help us believe that our futures were worth planning for. I said, I think it was not a sacrifice for him. I think it was the thing he most wanted to do. She said, that's exactly what he always said. By the sixth call I understood something I had been trying to articulate since the first one. Leonard had not left me a list of names as a mystery to solve. He had left me a list of names as a gift. He had spent 20 years doing something that mattered enormously to him, something that was, in the most direct possible way, an expression of who he was and what he believed about people and potential and the specific injustice of circumstances determining outcomes. And he had done it quietly, not because he was secretive, but because he was Leonard, and Leonard did not perform his goodness. He simply practiced it, consistently, without requiring an audience. The list was his way of introducing me to 20 years of his life that he had not known how to bring into the life we shared. Not because he was hiding it but because it had felt, perhaps, too personal. Too much the central thing about himself to be easily narrated at the dinner table. Too important to summarize. He had wanted me to hear it in the voices of the people it had mattered to. I understood that, by the sixth call. There were 8 more names. In the months between the 6th name and the 7th, something happened that changed the shape of the story. I had a conversation with Margaret, the director of the Gateway Project, whom I arranged to meet in person specifically because I wanted to understand the full scope of what Leonard had done, beyond what the individual ments could tell me from their own particular experience of him. Margaret was 62, had founded Gateway 24 years earlier, and had the particular combination of idealism and pragmatism that I have come to associate with people who build things that actually work over long periods of time. She had known Leonard for 20 years. She spoke about him with the warmth of someone who had worked alongside a person they respected completely, and also with a directness that told me she was going to tell me the truth without prettifying it. We met at the Gateway offices, which were 3 rooms above a pharmacy on a busy high street, furnished with the specific aesthetic of organizations that spend every pound on their actual work rather than their surroundings. She made tea. We sat at a table that was slightly too small for the amount of paper on it. She said, Dorothy, I want to tell you something about Leonard that I have been uncertain whether to tell you, because I don't know what he shared with you and what he kept private. But given that he left you the list, I think he intended for you to know. I said, please tell me. She said, Leonard was our most consistent and effective mentor for 20 years. That is the public part of what he did, and it was considerable. But there is also a private part. She said, when Leonard first came to us, we had a funding problem, as we always have a funding problem, as every organization like ours always has a funding problem. We could provide the mentoring, but we could not always provide the practical support that ments needed. Course materials. Travel costs for interviews. In some cases, the specific equipment or software that certain degree programs required. These are small amounts individually. But they are amounts that young people from the families we work with often simply do not have, and the absence of £200 for a laptop or £50 for a train fare to an interview can determine the entire trajectory of a person's life. I said, "What did Leonard do?" Margaret said, "He funded them." Quietly, consistently, without making it a significant thing. He never used the word donation. He used to call it filling gaps. He would identify, with each mentee, the specific practical gap that stood between them and the next stage, and he would fill it. Over 20 years, to the best of our records, Leonard personally contributed just under £60,000 in what he called gap funding to young people at Gateway. I sat very still. I said, £60,000. She said, yes. Over 20 years. In small, specific amounts, always targeted at a particular practical need. He was meticulous about it. He kept a record. He gave me a copy after his diagnosis, I think because he wanted to make sure we could continue the approach even after he was gone. He called the record the Gap Book. I said, "I didn't know about the money." She said, "I suspected you might not." Leonard he was not someone who shared his generosity. He practiced it, very consistently, and he did not narrate it. I think he felt that narrating it would make it about him rather than about the people it was for. But £60,000 over 20 years, Dorothy, that is not something I could allow to go unacknowledged to his wife. I think he would forgive me for telling you. I thought about our finances over 20 years. Leonard's teacher's salary had been modest. Mine, as a part-time librarian and later as a full-time one, had supplemented it but had never been large. We had been comfortable but not wealthy. The Italy trip, which we had talked about for 20 years and taken in Leonard's final months, had been the most expensive single thing we had done together, and I had thought of it as a splurge. £60,000, distributed quietly over 20 years in small specific amounts, was not a splurge. It was a commitment. Sustained, deliberate, calibrated, invisible. I said, "Did he ever mention it? To anyone?" Margaret said, "To me, occasionally, when a particular situation required a larger contribution and he wanted to think through whether it was the right use of the resource. Never as self-promotion. Always as a logistical question. He would say, 'I have this available this month, does it fit where it is most needed?' And then he would send the money and not mention it again. I drove home from that meeting and sat in the kitchen for a long time. I thought about Leonard at our kitchen table, marking mathematics books, quietly. Leonard in the garden, growing tomatoes with engineer's precision. Leonard at his philosophy group on Thursday evenings, returning with the specific thoughtful energy of a man who has spent 2 hours arguing carefully about things that actually matter. I thought about all the evenings of 41 years in which I had known, completely, who I was married to. I thought, I did know who I was married to. What I did not know was the scale of it. The consistent, sustained, 20-year scale of something that was, in every individual instance, simply Leonard being himself. I went back to the list. The 7th name was Grace Osei. Grace was 28. She was a pharmacist. She had grown up the eldest of 6 children in a family where both parents worked long hours in healthcare support roles, her mother a healthcare assistant, her father a hospital porter, and the idea of Grace becoming a pharmacist had been a family dream across 2 generations, spoken of often and pursued, through Leonard's mentorship, with the specific practical step-by-step planning it required. Grace said, "My family used to call Leonard Mr. Leonard. My mother still talks about him. She never met him, he always met me separately, always kept our relationship professional, which I think he did deliberately so I could have a space that was entirely mine and not filtered through family. But she knew about him. He was talked about at our dinner table for years." I said, "He was talked about at your family's dinner table." She said, "Every time I had a piece of progress. Every university offer, every exam result, every qualification. My mother would say, "Tell Mr. Leonard." My dad would say, "What did Mr. Leonard think?" He was part of our family story even though he never sat at our table. I thought about Leonard sitting at our own table, quietly, and said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "I think that would have meant a great deal to him." She said, "The last time I saw him, about a year before he died, I didn't know he was ill. He asked me about my professional development plans. Not about my family, not about whether I was happy, though he always asked those things too. He asked me where I saw myself in 5 years and what specific thing was standing between me and that version of myself. And I told him about the independent prescribing qualification I was considering. And he said, what would it cost to do it this year rather than in 2 years? And I told him. And he said, let me see what I can do. And 3 weeks later there was a small grant in my Gateway account. I did not tell Grace about the £60,000 and the Gap book. I was not sure it was mine to share. But I thought about it during the call and for a long time afterward. The 8th name was Reuben Ayres. Reuben was 32. He was a documentary filmmaker. He had grown up in a seaside town with very limited cultural infrastructure, no film industry connection, no family history in the arts, and an absolute certainty from a very young age that the thing he was supposed to do was make films about real people's real lives. He had come to Gateway not because he needed help with university applications, he was capable of navigating those on his own, but because he needed someone to take the idea of a career in documentary filmmaking seriously enough to help him think about it practically rather than dismissing it as an impossible ambition. Leonard had helped him think about it practically for 4 years. He had helped him research the specific pathway, the degrees, the entry-level positions, the industry contacts worth pursuing. He had helped him fund the equipment for his first short film, which had been accepted to a student film festival, which had led to his first commission. Reuben said, I have made 7 documentaries. 3 of them are about people who were told, at some point, that what they wanted was not realistic. That is not a coincidence. Leonard used to say that the most dangerous phrase in the English language is not realistic. He said, it has ended more careers before they started than any other 3 words. I made my first documentary about a musician who was told at 17 that music was not a realistic ambition. She won a national award at 35. I dedicated it to Leonard. I said, he would not have expected a dedication. Reuben said, I know. That's exactly why I gave him one. The 9th name was Fatima al-Rashid. Fatima was 30. She was a structural engineer. She had come to the UK from Lebanon at the age of 10 with her family, who were educated professionals whose qualifications, like Amir Hassan's father, were not recognized in the British system. Her father was an engineer who was working as a delivery driver when Fatima met Leonard at 15. Fatima said, the thing Leonard understood, that many people did not understand, was that my situation was not just about my ambitions. It was also about what my father had lost. I think he recognized that I was not only trying to build my own future. I was also trying to complete something my father had been prevented from completing. Leonard understood that without me having to explain it at length. He saw it. She paused. She said, when I qualified, the thing I was most proud of was showing my father my degree certificate. Not because I needed his approval. Because I wanted him to see that the knowledge he had given me, the way he explained physics and mathematics at our kitchen table since I was 5 years old, had produced something. Had been honored. Leonard helped me see that my engineering was also my father's engineering in a direct way. That my degree was in some sense completing something he had been interrupted in completing. The 10th name was Daniel Wright. Daniel was 35. He was a secondary school history teacher. He had grown up in a series of rented houses with a single mother who worked as a checkout operator, and the defining quality of his childhood, as he described it, had been the combination of absolute maternal love and the complete absence of what he called institutional navigation knowledge, the understanding of how educational systems work and how to move through them strategically. He taught history at a secondary school in a former industrial area of the city. He had a form group he had been with for 3 years. He spoke about them with the specific, warm attention to individual detail that I was beginning to recognize as something Leonard had modeled and that had, in some direct way, been transmitted. He said, "I teach the way Leonard mentored." I know that's a big thing to say. But I mean it in a specific way. He didn't teach me history, he was a mathematician, history was my passion. What he taught me was how to notice people. How to see them specifically. I try to do that with my students. I try to ask them what they are interested in rather than what they are good at. Leonard was the person who taught me the difference. I said, he made that distinction often. I had heard him make it many times. Daniel said, "Did he tell you why?" I said, "He said that what you are good at is largely a product of what has been available to you to practice. What you are interested in is a product of who you actually are." He said the second is a more reliable guide to what someone should do with their life. Daniel said, "Yes. That is exactly what he said to me. He said it when I was 17 and it took me years to fully understand it and I have never stopped thinking about it." The 11th name was Kavya Nair. Kavya was 27. She was a junior doctor in her second year of foundation training, specializing with an interest in pediatrics. She was the second doctor on the list. She had come to Gateway at 16, referred by the Gateway Project's relationship with a local secondary school that had identified her as a high-achieving student from a family with no university background and limited awareness of the medical school application pathway. She said, Leonard used to bring in newspaper articles and journal extracts about specific areas of medicine. He researched them himself. He'd had no medical training, but he educated himself specifically so he could discuss them with me intelligently. He did this so I would feel my interest was taken seriously rather than simply supported. There is a difference between someone saying your ambition is valid and someone sitting across from you and engaging with it as though it is real and specific and worth thinking about carefully. Leonard did the second thing. I said, he did that with everything. He educated himself about whatever the person he was interested in was interested in. She said, did he talk about us? His ments? I thought about this carefully. I said, not by name. Not specifically. He would occasionally mention that someone at Gateway had had a good piece of news or that a particular young person had got through a difficult period. He maintained your confidentiality completely. What he communicated to me was the emotional tone of the work, that it mattered to him enormously, that he found it deeply meaningful, that he was proud of the young people in a way that was entirely genuine. But the specifics were yours. She said, that is very exactly who he was. He made everything feel like it belonged to us. Even the work of mentoring us felt like our story rather than his. After the 11th call, I went to see our financial advisor. His name was Gerald, and he had managed our finances, mine and Leonard's together and now mine alone, for 20 years. He was a calm, precise man who I had always found trustworthy precisely because he did not perform enthusiasm and he did not cushion difficult information. I had not gone to Gerald specifically because of what Margaret had told me about the £60,000. I had gone because, in the aftermath of understanding what Leonard had been doing for 20 years, I wanted to understand our financial history more completely than I had. What Gerald showed me confirmed what Margaret had described, and extended it. Leonard had, over the course of 20 years, made regular small transfers from our joint savings account to a separate account in his name that I had known about in the vague way that you know about your spouse's financial arrangements without having ever had reason to examine them closely. The account had been described, in our financial planning documents, as Leonard's discretionary account, money he used for things that were his own rather than shared expenses. I had understood this to mean things like books, philosophy group fees, occasional golf with a friend he had known since university. The discretionary account had seemed, from the small regular transfers and the reasonable balance Gerald described when I had seen summaries of our finances over the years, exactly that, a modest personal fund for small personal pleasures. What Gerald showed me was that the transfers into this account, over 20 years, amounted to considerably more than small personal pleasures. They had been modest enough in any given month not to significantly affect our shared finances or to prompt any conversation. Over 20 years they amounted, as Margaret had said, to just under £60,000. Gerald said, "I want to say something, Dorothy, that I hope you will receive in the spirit in which it is intended." I did not know what Leonard used this account for. I knew the transfers were regular and consistent and were within the amounts he had always told me he needed for personal expenses. I had no reason to investigate further, and it would not have been appropriate for me to do so. But I want to say, I have reviewed the records since Leonard's death, and I can confirm that every pound that went into this account went out again in the form of targeted payments to individuals and to the Gateway Project. There is nothing in these records that suggests anything other than that Leonard spent this money precisely as he intended, on precisely what he said. I said, "I know. I am not upset by the money." Gerald said, "No. I didn't think you would be. I just wanted you to know I had looked." I said, "I am trying to understand something, Gerald. Not the money itself but the shape of it. The decision to do this quietly, for 20 years, without telling me." Gerald said, "I can't speak to Leonard's intentions. But I have known him for 20 years. My observation, for what it's worth, is that he was a man who was not comfortable with the idea of receiving credit for generosity. I think he may have worried that if he told you, it would have become a thing that was discussed and acknowledged, rather than a thing that was simply done. And he wanted it to be a thing that was simply done." I said, "He used to say that generosity narrated is not quite the same thing as generosity practiced." Gerald said, "Yes. That sounds like him." I drove home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about what it means to know someone for 41 years and to discover, after they are gone, that there was a dimension to them that was not hidden so much as practiced in a register too quiet for ordinary daily life to fully register. I thought about whether I was hurt by the quietness. I sat with that question for a long time. The honest answer was, not hurt. Something more complicated. Something that was partly grief, for the conversations we had not had, for the version of Leonard I had not fully known while he was alive. And partly something else, a quality of recognition, of seeing him more completely than I had, which felt like a form of closeness rather than a form of distance. He had left me 14 names. There were 3 left. The 12th name was the one I was least prepared for. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 38. She was the oldest person on the list. When I searched her name, nothing immediately appeared. No professional profile, no public presence. I emailed the address on Leonard's list. Eleanor replied 3 days later. Her email was longer than the others had been. She said she had thought many times about reaching out since hearing of Leonard's passing and had not known how to begin. She said she was a secondary school teaching assistant and a part-time art student, completing a degree she had started at 35. She said she had known Leonard not through Gateway but through a program he had run, quietly, alongside his Gateway work, a one-to-one correspondence program for adults who had been in the care system and had not had the opportunity to pursue the education they had wanted as young people. She had been in local authority care from the age of 6. She had left at 18 with a handful of GCSEs and no one to help her understand what came next. She had spent her 20s and early 30s moving between jobs, relationships, and periods of instability that she described with a precision and self-awareness that told me she had done a great deal of thinking about her own life. She had encountered the correspondence program through a care leavers charity when she was 33. The program matched adults who had been in care with volunteer mentors who were willing to write actual letters, physical letters, by post, rather than emails or text messages, on the basis that the formality and the time involved in writing and posting a letter created a quality of attention that digital communication rarely produced. Leonard had been her correspondent for 5 years. 5 years of letters. Weekly, or close to weekly. About her life, her history, her interests, her fears, her emerging conviction that she wanted to go back to education, her hesitation, her eventual decision, her first year of the degree, her growing confidence. She said, "We had a phone call, not a video call, because she preferred it." Leonard's letters were the first things in my adult life that made me feel as though I existed to someone in a specific, irreplaceable way. Not as a client. Not as a statistic. Not as a former carelever. As Eleanor. He wrote about what I had said in my previous letter with the attention of someone who had genuinely read it and thought about it. He asked questions. He remembered details across months of correspondence. He once referenced something I had mentioned in a letter 6 months earlier, which told me he kept my letters and reread them. He kept my letters. I said, he kept letters. Everything important, he kept. She said, he told me once that the work of a teacher was not finished when the lesson ended. That the most important thing a teacher could do was to stay present in a student's mind as a voice that believed in them, because there would be times when that voice was the only one saying the true thing. He wrote letters so that the voice would be literal. So that when I needed it, I could take an actual letter out of an actual envelope and hear him saying it again. He said, "Keep the letters, Eleanor. Read them when you need them." I said, "Did you keep them?" She said, "All of them. 5 years of weekly letters. I have a box." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "Eleanor, would you be willing to meet, sometime, in person? I would very much like to meet you." She said, "I was going to ask you the same thing." The 13th name was Tobias Marchetti. Tobias was 24. He was the youngest person on the list. He was still a student, a postgraduate researcher in applied mathematics at a Russell Group university. Leonard had mentored Tobias from the age of 16 until his diagnosis, when Tobias was 22. Tobias had Italian heritage on his father's side and had grown up between two cultures in a way that had sometimes made both feel slightly unbelonging. His mathematical ability was exceptional, identified early, and almost lost at 17 in a collision of undiagnosed dyslexia, a secondary school that had not known how to support him, and a period of significant anxiety that had kept him out of school for 4 months. Leonard had worked with Tobias through that period, through the return to school, the identification of the dyslexia, the specialist support, the rebuilt confidence, the university application, the first year. And then, when Leonard was diagnosed, he had told Tobias early, before most people, because he felt Tobias deserved the truth rather than a sudden disappearance, and because he trusted Tobias to hold the information without it becoming a weight that distorted the final months of their working relationship. Tobias said, when he told me, I said something very inadequate. I said I was sorry. And he said, "Don't be sorry. I have had an extraordinary life. I have watched a great many people become the fullest version of themselves. I am a mathematician. I understand that the value of a function is not determined by when it terminates. The value is determined by the shape of it. And I think the shape of mine has been pretty good." I sat with that for a long time. I said, "He said that?" Tobias said, "Yes." I wrote it down immediately. I knew I would need it. I said, "So did I need it? Thank you for telling me." The 14th name was the last. Her name was Josephine Park. Josephine was 31. She was a community arts project coordinator, working with young people in the same area of the city where Leonard had started his teaching career. She had grown up in a Korean-British family in a neighborhood with high deprivation indicators, a secondary school with high staff turnover, and an absolute passion, from the age of 8, for music, specifically for composition, for the mechanics of how sound became feeling. She had come to Gateway at 17, 1 year before Gateway's normal intake age, because a perceptive teacher had advocated for an exception and Leonard had agreed to take her on early. She had not become a professional musician. She had tried, university, a period of attempting a composition career, and had found that the life of professional composition, at least in the specific form available to someone without connections or financial cushion, was not compatible with who she was and what she needed. She had arrived at community arts work through a long path that she described as circuitous but not wasted. And she had, in her current role, built a program specifically for young people in her area who had the same kind of passion she had had at 8, the consuming, impractical, completely genuine passion for something that the people around them could not quite understand or validate. She said, "Leonard never told me music was a realistic career. He also never told me it wasn't. He did something much more useful. He told me that what I felt when I composed music, that specific feeling of putting something true into sound, was real and valuable and mine, regardless of what I did with it professionally. He said, Josephine, the thing inside you that does this is not contingent on whether anyone pays you for it. It is yours. Whatever your career turns out to be, do not let it take this from you." She said, "I think about that every day. I think about it specifically when I work with young people who have that same consuming passion for something that feels impractical. I tell them, this is yours. Whatever you do professionally, do not let anything take this from you." I said, "You are passing it on." She said, "I think that's what he was doing. I think that is what the list was. He was showing you that it passes on. That the thing he did, the attention, the specific seeing, it does not end when the person who practiced it ends. It continues, in the people who received it, and in the people those people give it to. He was showing you that his work had a kind of permanence." I sat at my kitchen table, with the list of 14 names in front of me, all followed now, all known. I said, "Yes. I think that is exactly what he was doing." I met Eleanor Whitfield in person 4 months after our phone call, on a Saturday in April, in a cafe in the city where she lived, which was 3 hours from my home and which I drove to because she had offered to come to me and I had said no, I would come to her, because it seemed right. Eleanor was 38. She had dark hair and the specific quality of composure of someone who has worked very hard to build steadiness from materials that did not originally include it. She was warm and direct and slightly formal in the way that people are when they are not sure yet how much of themselves to show. She had brought the letters. Not the originals. She had said on the phone that she would bring photocopies if I wanted to read some, and I had said yes, and so she had spent an evening photocopying selected letters from her box, choosing ones that she thought would give me what she described as the most complete picture of him as a correspondent. She placed a folder on the cafe table between us. She said, "You don't have to read them now. But they are there if you want them." I opened the folder. Leonard's handwriting. The specific careful handwriting he used for things he considered important, the same handwriting as the envelope in the bedside drawer, the same handwriting as the note on the list of names. I read the first letter. It was dated 7 years before his death. It was 3 pages long. It began with a response to something Eleanor had written, a specific observation about a book she had been reading, which Leonard had engaged with in detail, building on what she had said, adding his own thoughts, creating a genuine exchange rather than a one-way flow of advice. In the second page he wrote about a mathematics problem he had been thinking about, which had reminded him of something Eleanor had mentioned wanting to study, and which he had included on a folded piece of paper as something for a Tuesday afternoon when you have nothing better to do, which I suspect is never, but which I offer regardless. In the third page he wrote, "You mentioned last time feeling fraudulent at the art class. I want to address this specifically, because it is important and because I think you are wrong about it. Feeling fraudulent is the specific sensation of doing something outside the category you have been assigned. You have been assigned, by circumstance, to a category that does not include taking art classes. You are not fraudulent. You are expanding beyond the assignment. These are entirely different things. The fraud feeling is the category reasserting itself. Ignore it. Show up next Tuesday. I put the letter down. I said, he is completely himself in these letters. Eleanor said, yes. That was the thing. I had never received a letter before, not a real one. And his letters they were exactly him, on paper, in a form I could keep. The voice was identical. I knew, from his letters, exactly how he would sound if we met. And when we did occasionally meet, he was exactly the same. I read 3 more letters over the next hour, with Eleanor sitting across from me with her coffee, occasionally adding context about what her letter had said to prompt a particular response from Leonard. In the second letter I read, written 2 years before his death, Leonard wrote, Eleanor, I want to tell you something I have thought about often in our correspondence but have not said explicitly. You write to me about yourself with an exactness and a self-awareness that I find remarkable. You know yourself very precisely. This is not a small thing. Many people spend their entire lives in an approximate relationship with who they are. You have achieved a specific relationship with yourself that most people do not have at twice your age. I do not know what made that possible, given your history. I suspect it is because you have had to understand yourself in the absence of anyone reflecting you back to you, and that necessity has produced a kind of clarity. It is yours. It is one of the most important things about you. Eleanor said, I reread that letter perhaps once a month for the 2 years between when he wrote it and when he died. I still reread it. I said, he was right about you. In every letter, he was describing someone specific and real. I can hear the accuracy of it even without having known you before today. She said, that is the thing about Leonard. When he described you, you believed it, not because he was flattering you but because you could feel that it was true. He was not telling you who he hoped you were. He was telling you who you actually were. We stayed in the cafe for 4 hours. When we left, Eleanor and I embraced in the way that people embrace when they have shared something significant that creates an immediate closeness that ordinary meeting does not produce. She said, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would want to meet us. His Ments. I said, I have wanted to meet all of you. You are the most complete picture of him I have ever had. She said, you know, he talked about you. Not often, not in detail. But he mentioned you. He called you the person who made the rest of it possible. He said, Dorothy is the reason I have the steadiness to do this work. She is my foundation. I drove home with my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road and my mind entirely somewhere else. It has been 1 year since I followed the last name on the list. I want to tell you honestly what the year has given me and what it has cost me, because the true version of this story contains both of those things and I am not going to soften either. What it has cost me, a version of grief I had not expected. Losing Leonard was the grief I had prepared for, in the specific way that you can prepare for something you know is coming, and that preparation was useful and did not eliminate the loss but gave it a shape. What I did not prepare for was the grief of discovering, in the year after his death, aspects of his life that I had not known, and feeling the specific longing to have known them while he was alive. To have talked about Marcus Webb and Priya Sharma and Eleanor and Josephine and the 14 names at our kitchen table. To have asked him, across the breakfast table, about the Gap book and the £60,000 and the 4-hour drive to a university campus on a Tuesday evening to sit with a young man who was considering giving up. I could not have those conversations. That loss is real and I hold it. What it has given me, a completeness. I know Leonard now in a way I did not know him while he was alive. Not because he was hiding, he was not hiding. Because some parts of a person are expressed through their actions rather than their narration, and the actions that expressed this part of Leonard were not ones I had direct access to. I had the emotional residue of them, the specific quality of contentment he carried, the way his Tuesdays and Thursdays had a particular quality of purpose, the things he said at dinner that had obviously originated from conversations earlier in the day. I had always known that the gateway work mattered to him. I had not known how much, in what specific ways, at what personal and financial cost. Knowing now is not a consolation for not having known then. But it is its own form of knowing, and I receive it as the gift Leonard intended it to be. My son Philip, when I told him about the list and the names and the money and the gap book, was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I knew he was like this. But I didn't know the scale. I said, neither did I. Philip said, are you angry? That he didn't tell you? I thought about this carefully, because it is a question I have asked myself many times. I said, no. I understand why he didn't. He would have found the narrating of it, the being known for it, being thanked for it, uncomfortable in a way that would have changed the nature of the thing itself. He needed it to be about them, not about him. Telling me would have made it about him. I understand that, even though I wish I had known. Philip said, Dorothy is the reason I have the steadiness to do this work. She is my foundation. He was quoting Eleanor's account of what Leonard had told her. I had told Philip what Eleanor had said. Philip said, he did tell you, Mum. He just told you in a way that took a year to reach you. I held that sentence for a long time. Sarah, when I told her, cried, the specific, complicated crying of someone receiving information that makes them simultaneously happy and sad in proportions too difficult to separate cleanly. She said, he was always telling us this kind of thing about people. How extraordinary they were. How much potential was everywhere if you looked at the right angle. I always thought he was talking about his students, generically. He was talking about specific people. He was talking about them. I said, yes. He was always talking about specific people. That was the whole of it. Specific people. I have stayed in contact with several of the 14. Marcus Webb sends me a message at Christmas and on the anniversary of Leonard's death, and last summer he sent a photograph of a bridge his team was completing, with a note that said simply, one more for Leonard. I have it on the wall of my kitchen. Eleanor and I meet for lunch 3 or 4 times a year. She is completing her degree. Her art is extraordinary, I have seen it, and she is, with her specific hard-won clarity of self, exactly who Leonard described in his letters. Josephine sent me a recording of a composition she had written in the weeks after hearing of Leonard's death. She said she had composed it the way he had described composition to her, as putting something true into sound. The piece is 17 minutes long and it is, in my untrained listener's understanding, extraordinarily good. I listen to it sometimes in the evenings. I feel him in it. James Okonkwo, the mathematics teacher, sent me a message last September saying that the boy in his form group, the one who reminded him of himself at that age, had received an offer from his first-choice university. He said, I thought you should know. The chain continues. The chain continues. That is what Leonard knew. That is what the list was for. I want to say something, at the end of this story, about what I think Leonard was teaching me. Not his ments. Me. I think the list of names was Leonard's final act of the specific attention that had defined his entire life. He had spent 41 years of marriage being attentive to me in the daily, close-up way that a husband attends to a wife, noticing what I needed, remembering what mattered to me, showing up in the specific small ways that constitute genuine presence in a shared life. But the list was attentive to me in a different register. It was attentive to what I would need after he was gone, not immediately, not in the raw first months, but later, when the immediate grief had softened enough that I could receive something more complex. He had thought about that future need with the same care he applied to identifying what a 16-year-old mentee needed to take the next step in their education. He had thought, Dorothy will need to know who I was, fully, when I am not there to show her. She will need to hear it from people who experienced the parts of me that our shared daily life did not reveal. She will need to know that what I did with my Tuesdays and Thursdays was real and specific and mattered. And she will need to know it in a way that is embodied, in faces and voices and lives, not in a document. So he left me a list of the people who embodied it. I want to say something to everyone watching this about what you carry without knowing you carry it. Every specific, attentive, genuine act of noticing another person, every time you say the true thing to someone about who they specifically are, every time you remember the detail that tells them their particular self is held, those things do not end when the moment ends. They live in the people who received them. They shape the people those people become. They are transmitted, generation to generation, in the specific way that James Okonkwo transmits Leonard's attention to the boy in his form group who needed it. You do not have to know this to do it. Leonard did not do it in order to create a legacy. He did it because it was who he was, and because it was the thing that most needed doing, and because a person's capacity for seeing others specifically is not diminished by use. It grows. I am 72 years old. I have one shelf of photocopied letters, a photograph of a bridge on my kitchen wall, a recording of a 17-minute piece of music, and 14 names that changed the shape of everything I thought I knew. I knew Leonard completely. I also knew him only partially. Both of those things are true. I hold them together, the way you hold everything true about a person you have loved for 41 years and will spend the rest of your life still learning. If Dorothy and Leonard's story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe. We share complete, powerful stories every single week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, was Leonard right to keep this part of his life quiet? Or should he have told Dorothy while he was alive? And what was the moment in this story that stayed with you most? I read every single comment. Every word of every one.